Ladies and gentlemen, this video wasn't supposed to be about this. I was originally going to cover some MTG Arena streamer doing a video with a Yu-Gi-Oh guy. It was going to be fun. There were going to be elk jokes. God damn it, Oko. But then Wizards had to do this shit and it just blows the fuck up. So, allow me to introduce someone you already know pretty well. Wizards of the Coast. They're the subsidiary, or, well, former subsidiary. They've kind of changed the internal structure of Hasbro, where Wizards of the Coast is now like a full-on division of... Anyway, they make MTG, and more relevantly to this video, Dungeons & Dragons. For the past 23 years, Dungeons & Dragons has operated on a license known as the Open Game License, or OGL. And to make a long story short on the matter, a draft of an update was leaked online. People hated it because of the provisions in it that seemed to close D&D from being able to be developed on by anyone else without cutting Wizards a check. That's an oversimplification, but the details of the 1.1 OGL are covered far better by actual lawyers all over YouTube. Largely unimportant to what I'm talking about, and something I'm not going to sink into deeply when not necessary. Wizards was silent for really too long of a time about this, until January 13th. Actually, like 3 weeks after this initial leak, when they posted an article on D&D Beyond's website entitled "An Update on the Open Game License," which serves as their official response to this controversy. That article is what I'm going to be covering today, and I'm trying to get this done in like 3 days so that, you know, hopefully I can get this in before there's more updated shit that I have to add. So forgive me if their production is a little bit less flashy than it normally would be. And to be fair, it could be worse, but let me get into what this response actually says. When we initially conceived of revising the OGL, it was with 3 major goals in mind. First, we wanted the ability to prevent the use of D&D content from being included in hateful and discriminatory products. This is a massive red flag, at least for me. Because while in theory preventing your platform from being used for hate speech and discrimination is something someone should want, how do you enforce that under a system that is intended to allow others freedom? It's very possible to balance these two things, but the only way to really make that happen is to create something that takes control away from others and puts it in your hands. I'm going to come back to this kind of, sort of, a little bit, but the long and the short of it is that it communicates that you do, in fact, intend for OGL 1.1 to control what content can and cannot be published, which goes against the spirit of the OGL inherently. Second, we wanted to address those attempting to use D&D in Web3, blockchain games, and NFTs by making clear that OGL content is limited to tabletop role-playing content like campaigns, modules, and supplements. That's not so much a clarification, though, as it is changing the deal. Because those things actually are allowed under OGL 1.0a, which there will be a link in the description for. To quote from the definitions, first under Section G. Use, used, or using means to distribute, copy, edit, format, modify, translate, or otherwise create derivative material of open game content. So to define derivative material, we go to B in definitions. I am going somewhere with this, trust me. Derivative material means copyrighted material, including derivative works and translations, including into other computer languages, quotation, modification, correction, addition, extension, upgrade, improvement, compilation, abridgment, or other form in which an existing work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. In other words, you are literally trying to take away uses that would actually be covered under the OGL. There's something I'm going to get into in my final thoughts in regards to open game content, but there is something I kind of have to ask. How realistically would open game content be used for NFTs? I can see blockchain games because a game can use the open game content. That makes sense. But NFTs are just an authenticator at the end of the day. And they don't even provide copyright. Anything involving copyright with them would have to go through the same channels the one would already be going through for copyright protection. So, doesn't change anything. Look, I'm fully aware. I'm not a lawyer, and I am fully aware that NFTs can be a very complex legal mess. But, to be honest, maybe somebody could correct me on this, but I fail to see how anything in what either version of the OGL does to actually address that. Either 1.0A already creating a restriction on that people can loophole around, or 1.1 closing that loophole. I just don't see where that's happening in either instance. And third, we wanted to ensure that the OGL is for the content creator, the home brewer, the aspiring designer, our players, and the community. Not major corporations to use for their own commercial and promotional purpose. Except these things aren't mutually exclusive. A major corporation can create content and homebrew for the players that also serves a commercial and promotional purpose. Both of these things can be what's happening at the same time. Hell, an aspiring designer can also create content for a commercial and promotional purpose. In my work, trying to get a series I want to work on off the ground, one aspect of what I considered doing to fulfill the needs of my product was creating D&D 5e content that served to communicate to people ideas that are found within the work. It would promote the show, I'd be able to sell it, but I would still be creating content. I'll get into this later, but there's a royalty provision that you wrote into this document that I will want to address that in theory separates someone like me from a major corporation, but, well, when we get to it, I'm going to go over how it doesn't actually do that. Driving these goals were two simple principles. 1, our job is to be good stewards of the game, and 2, the OGL exists for the benefit of the fans. Nothing about those principles has wavered for a second. Okay, so on paper, this sounds like a good thing to say. Very good, right? Like, right before you actually apologize? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give it this way now. They kind of apologize, but we'll get into some of the ways that this apology doesn't track well. Although I do want to talk about something that a lot of people don't realize is untrue about this particular statement. The OGL isn't really for the benefit of the fans. Things that are covered under the OGL are things that would already be legal for people to include, admittedly with the OGL serving as essentially a promissory note that the wording for these things in a particular reference wouldn't get someone in legal trouble. Legal Eagle actually pointed out that what qualifies as open game content in accordance with OGL 1.0A already really can't be copyrighted. Really, all the OGL provides to the licensee is the ability to print the rules with the wording that Wizards of the Coast has used. It's possible that something specific to the wording that people need to use are copyrightable, but I'm not so sure there is in terms of what's covered in the OGL, with the SRD really just serving as a reference sheet for what those things look like. But let's assume, there is something else that allows for that wouldn't normally be allowed. Well, 1.0A already requires you to include a copy of the license in your work. One of the controversial provisions in 1.1 is that they can seemingly steal other people's work. Now, I'll get more detailed on that provision later, but 1.0A already has that. You have to use the same license, so they can just print anything that you made in their own books already. But they have to follow the same rules. They have to identify it as open game content. And if they're doing so without your permission, they don't even have to credit you for it. They say that the reason the provision in 1.1 is there is in order to prevent lawsuits from the same idea being presented independently by multiple people. And I honestly believe that the intent of 1.0A is for that to also be the case. But well, the way it's put in the leak is that this provision is to protect Wizards from suit. So in theory, the same reasoning could be applied to 1.0A, which means no, 1.0A is not for the benefit of the fans, since the benefit the fans get is negligible in comparison to the benefit WotC gets, no matter how you slice it. That was why our early drafts of the new OGL included the provisions they did. That draft language was provided to content creators and publishers so their feedback could be considered before anything was finalized. And it taking you a couple of paragraphs to start saying things that sound correct is also a thing that's happening here. Look, I would get into this in my final thoughts, but I've got bigger fish for that, so I'm going to address this here. Based on what you're trying to sound like you're expressing, this should be simple. This was a draft. It was intended for feedback. We're going to listen to the feedback. We're sorry, and thank you for telling us what you think. That's it. You do say those things. And it's, for the most part, all of the other stuff you're saying that makes you sound fake as fuck. In addition to language allowing us to address discriminatory and hateful conduct and clarifying what types of products the OGL covers, our drafts included royalty language designed to apply to large corporations attempting to use OGL content. It was never our intent to impact the vast majority of the community. So, let's touch on your language to cover large corporations again. And there's a big argument that people are screaming at me right now, but we're going to push that to the side at first. Your royalty is based on the amount of money made on content under the OGL. This whole argument of only impacting large corporations trying to leech off of you is asinine because it assumes that they are using it as a major source of revenue when just earlier you were talking about promotional use, which could very well be a free fucking handout of an adventure module that takes place in the world. Even if we're talking commercial and promotional at the same time, that could still be a $5 thing that they sell for cheap so people will buy it, which would require 150,000 sales at that price, which could in theory be a big corporation doing numbers like that, or just Mr. Beast on a Tuesday. But then we get to the crux of the issue. The amounts that you chose are not reflective of a large corporation. That's reflective of a company that happens to be big enough to make a decent profit doing D&D content. So let's say I'm creating 4 books in a fiscal year, right? And I'm selling those books for $20 a pop, which is actually cheaper than what most people are selling supplements for, even in digital, so we're being generous. Do you know how many sales at that price total I have to make to reach that threshold? 37.5 thousand. Even if we assume no one is buying 2 of my products in the same year, that's still less than 1% of the people playing D&D 5e that have to like what I'm doing enough to pay for my book. And less than 10,000 people buying all 4 would put me at your threshold. And considering that, let's be real for a second. 25% royalty on the gross. That is a massive. Book publication operates typically on a 10% profit margin, and even ebook publication doesn't get much better from what I've seen because you have to sell for less to be competitive. So all of a sudden, if you make 1.5 million gross, then you're actually in the red. Yeah, offering custom deals for publishers that consistently do well doesn't really track when consistently doing well actually hurts their business. I have a hard time thinking this was a mistake, or you not really understanding how much money these companies actually make, or their profit margins, because you're in the same industry as them. I'm sure some of my friends could call me out for not being aware of these figures were bullshit before, and now being willing to call out that these figures are bad, but I was just looking at what was presented, not really knowing the profit margins on the industry, and going by the 25% rule, because that what made sense to me. 5 seconds of Googling, I fixed my shit. You mean to tell me that your lawyers can't by just calling your own fucking financial department? Really? However, it's clear from the reaction that we rolled a 1. Okay, it's not in my script, but I want to talk about this. That implies you were making some kind of check to make this contract. Can't help but feel like the check you'd be making is like persuasion or deception. But maybe that's just me. It has become clear that it is no longer possible to fully achieve all 3 goals while staying true to our principles. So, here's what we are doing. The next OGL will contain the provisions that allow us to protect and cultivate the inclusive environment we are trying to build and specify that it covers only content for TTRPGs. That means that other expressions, such as educational and charitable campaigns, live streams, cosplay, VTT uses, etc., will remain unaffected by any OGL update. Content already released under 1.0a will also remain unaffected. This, in and of itself, is mostly fine, even though virtual tabletops are TTRPG content, for one, and they should already be under OGL 1.0A according to its wording. So, you know, you've kind of already been breaking it by forcing VTTs to operate on a custom agreement. But hey, I don't really know the agreement. It could involve things that aren't considered open game content. And well, either way, it's not really the point of this video anyway. So we're just gonna skip past it, but whatever. Otherwise, seems like a good thing to do if you actually do it that way. What it will not contain is any royalty structure. It also will not include the license back provision that some people were afraid was a means for us to steal work. That thought never crossed our minds. Under any new OGL, you will own the content you create. We won't. Any language we put down will be crystal clear and unequivocal on that point. The license back language was intended to protect us and our partners from creators who incorrectly allege that we steal their work simply because of coincidental similarities. As we continue to invest in the game that we love and move forward with partnerships in film, television, and digital games, that risk is simply too great to ignore. The new OGL will contain provisions to address that risk, but we will do it without a license back and without suggesting we have rights to the content you create. Your ideas and imagination are what makes this game special, and that belongs to you. Okay, so removing the royalty structure and the license back is good, but I want to explain why people would think that here and not with the original OGL, even though the original OGL had it too. And I also want to include a breakdown of the somewhat insidious way that the leaked version of 1.1 actually could theoretically steal other people's content. So the reason 1.0A looks like it doesn't let you steal content is because of the fact that it's worded so that everyone is playing by the same rules. Even though you can print what other people have come up with under it, you have to do the same thing that they have to do. You can't use their product identity. You have to label it as open game content, stuff like that. You can take in accordance with the rules, and they can in turn take it back in accordance with those same rules if they so desire. It does allow someone, including you, to abuse it, but it is fair in and of itself. But let's compare this to the 1.1 leak. First, we have an obvious thing about it. You can use their content, they have to pay if they use yours. It's no longer even keel. It's you in control and them underneath. That in and of itself is what makes people feel like they don't own their content. In spite of the fact that you literally put the words, you own the new and original content you create right there. But it's not as insidious as the other thing that I noticed. So they own the content, yes, but you happen to be able to print that content. We'll even assume that's a scenario for this that puts you in the friendliest light possible. You print what they've made, credit them, actively promote them in the course of doing so. Tell the reader to support the person who made this wonderful work that you're using. So now let's read the section that talks about what is unlicensed content. Not usable D&D content. Unlicensed content. This is Dungeons & Dragons content that has been or later will be produced as official. That is, released by Wizards of the Coast or any of its predecessors or successors, and is not present in the SRD version 5.1. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I bet there's a lot of non-lawyers who can read these things together and suddenly go, wait, they can revoke my license at any time, but my content is still licensed to them no matter what. So even if I own it, I functionally don't. If any lawyers are actually watching this video, I actually want to know if this is actually a situation that gets created in this. If it is, then I honestly don't think there's any way that wouldn't be intentional. Because you got to consider, even if the lawyers are writing it, the executives are telling them what they want in there and what they want to portray in it. So most likely it's being vetted by too many people for it to not be intentional on that front. Now, there's very little left worth covering here, but I do want to address the one thing that was really, really kind of heinous about this article. A couple of last thoughts. First, we won't be able to release the new OGL today because we need to make sure we get it right, but it is coming. I would sure hope you're not releasing it today because that would mean you didn't do jack shit with it. Second, you're going to hear people say that they won and we lost because making your voices heard forced us to change our plans. Those people will only be half right. They won, and so did we. This is the most backhanded thing. This is the real reason that so much about this sounds disingenuous as fuck. Like, imagine not getting the language you were after and then trying to call it a draw when you're the one who feels the need to apologize. As I pointed out, this should have been people, especially since you waited so long to make any comment on the situation. In fact, there's one more paragraph, and it's pretty reflective of what you should be saying. Our plan was always to solicit the input of our community before any update to the OGL. The drafts you've seen were attempting to do just that. We want to always delight fans and create experiences together that everyone loves. That's the police sirens calling me out on my bullshit, but I'm reading a Wizards thing, so that's the bullshit they're calling me out on. We realize we did not do that this time, and we are sorry for that. Our goal was to get exactly the type of feedback on which provisions worked and which did not, which we ultimately got from you. Any change this major could only have been done well if we were willing to take that feedback, no matter how it was provided. So we are. Thank you for caring enough to let us know what works and what doesn't, what you need and what scares you. Without knowing that, we can't do our part to make the new OGL match our principles. Finally, we'd appreciate the chance to make this right. We love D&D's devoted players and the creators who take them on so many incredible adventures. We won't let you down. Basically this paragraph is damn near everything you actually needed to say on its own. Promises about things you will backtrack on because of the feedback are good. Over-explaining your intent to the point where it becomes easy to realize you're just spouting buzzwords and regurgitating stuff that people hate? Not so much. The problem isn't really with this paragraph. Well, except that first sentence. Even if we put aside the fact that people you sent this to seem to think it was intended to be a finalized version of the new OGL, meaning it was not very clearly communicated that it was a draft, this comes across to me as technically true, but not in the sense that makes it a good thing. It's a classic negotiation tactic. Make a worse offer to begin with so that anything you offer after can be closer to what you actually want. Get it past the radar by sheer force of the alternative being worse. But you don't have the kind of power that others have tried to pull that with. See, the thing you're trying to take control of is the very thing that you don't own. Open game content isn't copyrightable in the first place. Sure, you own stuff by Beholders and Mind Flayers, but even within the SRD, there's very little of the actual names of things you can actually own. What you're trying to interpret the OGL as is something other than what it is. Not an open game license, but rather an official game license. But something can be unofficial, consider itself compatible with your game, and still be perfectly legal. In a lot of industries, you would get away with this. But in this one, we already know better. There's a license in development being backed by Paizo that is intended to be system agnostic and ensures that anyone can create games without having to worry about iterating on the work of others, which is perfectly legal and kind of how D&D became what it is today. Hell, it's how your other big moneymaker, Magic the Gathering, even exist, and also what a ton of other big moneymakers throughout Hasbro's history are based on, from Power Rangers to My Little Pony. It disgusts me that you would, for the past 60 years, going back long before the OGL, before Dungeons and Dragons even, take advantage of an open market and then now try to close it the way you're doing now. I know I flubbed my line. I don't care. I'm pissed off. I'm leaving it in. But I have some advice. For Hasbro shareholders, I've actually taken quite a bit of time to think about what this advice was going to entail because, well, I kind of am saying some executives need to be culled, and I should be very careful about which ones I say and why. My initial thought was Chris Cox, CEO of Hasbro. In 2016, he became the president of Wizards of the Coast, and his reign resulted in the growth of MTG Arena, which, despite its hiccups, has actually turned out pretty good. There's definitely things worth complaining about concerning the way he moved forward with MTG. He is kind of bad, but the more I think about it, he at least seems to know when to step back and let creatives do creative things. Which brings me to Cynthia Williams. She became president of Wizards in February of 2022 when Chris Cox was promoted to CEO of Hasbro. And to be quite frank, the truly awful decisions have come with her in charge. Most notably, last year's further increased aggression in Magic release schedule that resulted in Bank of America wanting to step in, of all people. And, part of the trick here is that you could argue that some of those decisions were extension of Chris Cox's direction, and he's the one who likely chose Cynthia as his successor after he was promoted to Hasbro CEO, especially since both of them come from Microsoft. But the D&D controversy is what really sells Cynthia as the problem to me. Because the first parts of the 1D&D playtests come around October of 2022, which is why I believe that it really is Cynthia's ideas that are the ones really hurting the company and their customer relations. After all, it's by that point that Cynthia's ideas really have a lot of time to take hold. Spelljammer was released in 5e in August with a racially insensitive depiction of Hadozi race that more or less wound up looking like a monkey-based race with mannerisms that resembled a stereotypical menstrual act combined with heavy implications of slavery in their backstory, including being happy to be enslaved, which they claim was just them printing the original without having properly vetted or edited it, even though there were later printings of the original that didn't have these aspects. Even if we presume that this is really just a mistake, that still shows that the quality control is more diminished under the leadership of Cynthia Williams in particular. And look, it's possible that she's still in the learning phase when it comes to an industry that she's a little less used to. But that comes down to the core of my advice. Something needs to be fixed over there, not just in terms of execution, but in terms of attitude. Wizards of the Coast didn't become Hasbro's biggest brand through aggressive monetization or having a tight grip over their properties. They did it through creativity, passion, and cultivating a community through a mutual respect for one another. Maybe when you look at the numbers that they succeed with, you guys in the boardroom should examine why the numbers go up when you guys step back.